Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies 2021 Distinguished Alumni Lecture. My name is Ann Hayner, Associate Director for Alumni Relations at the Kroc Institute. I'd like to begin by acknowledging our presence here at Notre Dame on the traditional homelands of Native peoples, including the Haudenosaunee, Miami, Peoria, and particularly the Pokagon Potawatomi, who have been using this land for education for thousands of years and continue to do so. We hope that our celebration today will honor the traditions of these Native peoples as we recognize a guest whose work is committed to justice and human rights. At the Kroc Institute, we are constantly aware that the accomplishments and fascinating career paths of our alumni are the chief source of our pride. Since 1987, when the first 4 undergraduate students were awarded a concentration in peace studies, the Kroc Institute has graduated over 1,800 alumni. This includes over 1,100 from what is now the undergraduate major or minor in peace studies, over 600 alumni from the master's program, and 37 from our doctoral program in peace studies. Now, as the Kroc Institute celebrates its 35th anniversary, our alumni are at work in over 100 countries around the world. Kroc Institute alumni have found a variety of ways to integrate peace studies into their professional work. Some identify as professional peace builders, while others have found ways to incorporate the knowledge and values of peace studies into a variety of distinct professions, from religious leadership to teaching, from journalism to parenting. The Kroc Institute's Distinguished Alumni Award honors graduates of Notre Dame's Peace Studies program whose careers and lives exemplify the ideals of peace building around the globe. In the past, we have honored Kenyan NGO leader George Wachira, development innovator Molly Kinder, educator and activist Carsonia Wise Whitehead of Baltimore, human rights lawyers and advocates, including Shabi Aguirre at the International Criminal Court, Vienna Colucci of Amnesty International, and Adriana Quiñones of UN Women. Ambassador Juana Popa of Romania, Chinese filmmaker Jian Yi, Nigerian journalist Obi Anyadike, theater director and writer P. Carl, and scholar practitioner Bina da Costa. To this list of distinguished alumni, we are now privileged to add Brittney Nystrom, Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Utah. I now invite Erin Corcoran, Executive Director of the Kroc Institute, to introduce our 2021 Distinguished Alumni Award winner.
Thank you, Ann, very much for that. Welcome, everyone. As Ann said, I'm the Executive Director of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, and one of my great privileges is to be able to participate in this Distinguished Alumni event every year. As Ann mentioned, our students, and by extension our alumni, are the lifeblood and the joy of this institute, and so much of what we do is about equipping them to be effective peace builders when they go out into the world. And I'm particularly honored to be able to introduce Brittney Nystrom today, because our professional paths have crossed in a variety of different roles and capacities over the last 20 years. Brittney Nystrom is a 1998 graduate of the University of Notre Dame with a major in peace studies and anthropology. And I first met Brittney when we were both newly minted attorneys in Washington, DC. We arrived to Washington, DC about the same time. I was working for an international human rights organization, and part of our work was to reach out to lawyers at large law firms and convince them to take on pro bono cases representing refugees and asylum seekers in immigration court. And Brittney worked at one of the law firms in DC, Fried Frank, which was one of our biggest volunteer or law firms that provided a ton of pro bono representation. And Brittney had just finished law school at Northwestern and had graduated. And part of her decision to go to law school was informed by her work right after graduating from Notre Dame in Madison, Wisconsin, where she was an AmeriCorps volunteer and worked as an employment counselor at a community justice center. And in that experience, it really exposed her to many of the struggles and injustices that were inherent in the US criminal justice system, and made her want to not just work on helping individuals with their cases, but also figuring out ways in how to change the system and be involved in sort of systemic and policy changes. And I think that led her to go to law school, where she then started working for Freed Frank. And then shortly after that became the director of the Capital Area Immigrant Rights Coalition, which was a partner organization that I worked with the organization I worked with, again, trying to find lawyers in the Washington, D.C. area to take on cases for refugees and asylum seekers with providing these legal services for free. And after that work, Brittany began to sort of really be invested in sort of taking the work that she learned working with individual cases and working with attorneys to advocate for systems and policy changes at the federal level. And I again encountered her when her role as the director of policy and legal affairs at the National Immigration Forum, which is an advocacy organization, a national advocacy organization that was advocating for significant changes to our federal immigration system when I was working in the Senate during the time in which the Senate was taking up comprehensive immigration reform. And from there, Brittany went on to work for, become the director of the Lutheran Immigration Refugee Services in Washington, D.C., where she continued to do advocacy work for vulnerable populations and immigrants. And so it's just been a real pleasure to watch her grow and take on these increasingly important leadership positions. And I think, you know, one of the themes that strikes me of the work that Brittany's been doing throughout her different roles is really focusing on ways in which to increase fairness at both the national and international systems. And, you know, so in her most recent work, she has been the director of the executive director of the ACLU of Utah, where she is still doing an incredible amount of work around immigration advocacy, but also expanding and diversifying efforts to advocate for sort of just policies for other populations. And there's no shortage of issues that could fall under the ACLU umbrella. And so she's noted that the organization has identified some priority issues that she's focusing on and participating in bringing together diverse coalitions across Utah who are working on a variety of different civil rights related issues. And I think, you know, although she probably couldn't have predicted where her journey would take her after she graduated from Notre Dame, she certainly now sees clear connections between her peace studies training as an undergraduate student and the work that she does now. In fact, when we talked with her recently and letting her know about this award, she explained to us that a lot of the advocacy that we do is conflict resolution. She says we are in many spaces where we're using dialogue and listening and trying to have both parties employ empathy and understanding why something matters and why there needs to be a change. Our work is really focused on being able to sit across the table from someone you think you fundamentally disagree with and trying to advocate for what you think is right and to see if there's a way to reach an outcome that is satisfactory on both sides. So we are just really delighted to welcome Brittany back to the Kroc Institute. I'm very excited to again see her and our paths cross again. I'm incredibly proud of the work that she's doing, and I'm excited to hear her today talk about a really important topic, overcoming intersections of oppression, immigrant and racial justice in the US. And we're going to present her with a symbol of our respect, the Distinguished Alumni Award. Brittany, the Kroc Institute is proud to recognize your dedication to working for a more just and peaceful world through engaged research, teaching, and policy advocacy, and to confer on you the Distinguished Alumni Award of the Kroc Institute. As inscribed on the base of the award, we are confident that you will go forth in peace. Congratulations and welcome back to the Kroc Institute, Brittany.
Thank you, Erin. It's a real pleasure to see you again, and to receive this award is just incredibly humbling and inspiring. Listening to the distinguished recipients that have come before me is just absolutely amazing, and I'm very proud to be here today. Welcome to all the students, the alumni, the Kroc Institute Advisory Board. I'm here today, as Erin mentioned, to speak to overcoming intersections of oppression, immigrant and racial justice in the US. As an introduction, my focus today is really on exposing the barriers to an unequal application of civil rights and civil liberties for immigrants and refugees, as well as Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the United States. My perspective is that of an advocate and an attorney representing immigrants and individuals deprived of their promised civil rights. The ACLU protects the rights of all people in the United States, but we do find that these rights die first on the margins of society. For over 100 years, the ACLU has pushed for equal rights and individual freedoms for everyone living in the United States. The intersections between our unequal treatment and oppression of certain populations are many. And of course, individual experiences differ based on both our actual and our perceived identities. And today I'm going to focus on similarities in the oppression of immigrants and refugees, as well as BIPOC communities and individuals, or Black, Indigenous, people of color. First, I want to talk about why and how America has denied these communities equal opportunity and the rights enshrined in our Constitution and our laws. Second, I want to talk about what impact this treatment has had on those communities and on the individuals who are oppressed. And finally, how do Americans achieve empowerment and inclusion, full access to the civil rights and the constitutional rights that we are so proud of, rather than oppression and exclusion? The first point I want to make is that we really, as Americans, have othered entire communities. And the murder of George Floyd last year and the months of protests that followed finally shattered the illusion that America is post-racist or colorblind for many of us. But there never was that illusion for Black, Indigenous, or people of color living in the United States. They know that America's constitutional rights and protections are applied unequally to them, that law enforcement agencies engage with their families in a way that is not the same as they engage with white families. This othering also has been a part of the experience for immigrants and refugees. And it has been said that America is a nation of immigrants. I believe that's true. But the warm and nostalgic saying that conjures up visions of harmony and equality just rings shallow. We celebrate stories and images of America as a welcoming land. And the cartoon on this slide shows America as a melting pot with the spoon of equal rights kind of stirring everyone together in this big pot of citizenship. We talk about newly arriving immigrants sailing past the Statue of Liberty and embarking on this wonderful new life in America. And that's part of our national mythology. And I think it's valid that America does have this kind of love affair with immigrants, but that love affair happens for immigrants in the past. It breaks down when you look at contemporaneous treatment of immigrants. And I think it's fair to say that waves of newcomers in America have always experienced and continue to experience a kind of demonization, closed doors, ghettoization. And that's a direct consequence of exclusionary laws and quotas that intended to limit and continue to limit immigration from certain countries and regions. The reality is that there is a clear through line in our history, in our laws, of racism and xenophobia. This exclusion was enshrined in our Constitution. It's baked into our immigration laws. It's part of our criminal laws, and it persists. This othering of immigrants and non-white individuals and communities has been both rooted in and has predictably generated fear. From Ellis Island to today, waves of immigrants, as well as Black, Indigenous, people of color who have been in the US for generations, have been associated with varieties of fear. Contagious diseases is one category of fear that is often associated with immigrants in particular. The latest hysteria around immigrants and contagious diseases is playing out on the US-Mexico border. Title 42 is a public health authority that's part of the US Code that bars people from entering the country during a health crisis. This title was evoked first by President Trump and is currently being used by President Biden as a way to turn away arriving immigrants and asylum seekers with no due process. This clearly violates legal obligations not to return individuals who fear persecution, torture, or death to their home country, but it's happening as we speak. Looking a little farther back, President Reagan required all immigrants to be tested for HIV, and anyone infected with HIV was ineligible for admission to the United States for 22 years. This bar only ended in 2010. A second big category of fear that swirls around immigrants and individuals of color are doubts of loyalty. And these have manifested themselves in many, many ways over the years. After World War II, there were laws that prohibited German language from being used in any mailed printed materials or being taught in public schools. And this was justified as a way to stop spying. The doubt around immigrants culminated in the forced internment of Japanese Americans after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. That internment included US citizens in a clear violation of the constitutional rights of American citizens. FBI surveillance has loomed over activists from the Black community, most famous maybe being Martin Luther King, but continuing up to Black Lives Matter activists today, as well as activists who are pushing to abolish immigration enforcement. The final category I'll mention is the boogeyman of immigrants and communities of color as being violent and more prone to commit crime. The rhetoric around immigration and refugees is often used to stoke fear. We're probably all familiar with the political rhetoric around Mexico sending us, quote, rapists and drug dealers, speculation that terrorists and dangerous individuals are hiding within migrant flows from Central America or within refugee populations, despite rigorous vetting of any refugee who's welcome to the United States. There are many, many horrific examples of Black men being marketed as predators and villains. Hopefully everyone's familiar with the case of Emmett Till and the need to, quote, protect white women. Finally, I'll just mention that many in the US government were focused on the possible threat from Black Lives Matter activists last summer, yet it was white supremacists who violently stormed and overran the US Capitol. So let's talk about othering to oppression. And American history is replete with portrayals of immigrants and non-white individuals as different, as inferior. And these constructs have often been used not only to set those communities aside, but then to also restrict their freedoms and their opportunities. Slavery and Jim Crow were obviously founded on and thrived on that construct of Black people as fundamentally different from others. There are many now obviously offensive caricatures of arriving immigrants, including the Irish, including the Chinese, that led to really dangerous employment and housing discrimination for those communities. And we are only starting to acknowledge the generational damage of forcing Native or Indigenous children to attend white boarding schools that suppress their culture and their language. Unfortunately, these examples continue into our recent history and up to today. And each of the points on this slide illustrates the intersectionality, the overlap between racial bias and anti-immigrant, anti-refugee sentiment. We just recently marked the 20th anniversary of September 11th. And for those of us who were working in the field of immigrants' rights after 2001, there is a real legacy of government surveillance of young men from Muslim and Arab countries. There was a program that was created especially to require registration for this community. And the Muslim ban that we saw under President Trump that targeted arriving immigrants from Muslim countries was undoubtedly part of this legacy. We saw President Trump candidly refer to El Salvador, Haiti, and African nations as, quote, shithole countries, pardon the language, while wishing for more Norwegian immigrants. And perhaps that is just the quintessential example of a racial bias and immigration coming together. We see conversations in this country around undocumented immigrants really being intertwined with conversations around MS-13 gang members. And if you look at media coverage of undocumented immigrants, you might notice that coverage on TV news of the undocumented population routinely is accompanied with mugshots of members of the MS-13 gang. Most recently, the Border Patrol response to Haitians attempting to enter the United States at the southern border has evoked the history of white law enforcement in the South acting as slave patrols or enforcing Jim Crow laws while on horseback. And this to me really brings up that quote I mentioned at the outset, that civil rights die first at the margins of society. And the borderlands have historically been this area where the government first unveils efforts to curtail individual rights and freedoms. We see this over and over again, whether it be international human rights obligations to protect individuals seeking humanitarian protection, or utilizing surveillance technology, or restricting movement, or even photography. All of those kind of are tested in the borderlands first. This brings us to the institutions that exist within our criminal legal system. And it reminds us that the lack of immigrant and racial justice is not only limited to policies that are created in reaction to current events. So the example of how Haitian migrants on the border are treated might feel like a temporary in the moment reaction, but I want to focus on the criminal legal system as an example of an institution that has been distorted by racial disparities and biases, despite constitutional promises of due process, promises that law enforcement will respect civil rights and will honor the Bill of Rights. The ACLU of Utah spends more than half of our time and resources overcoming civil rights violations that stem from the criminal legal system. I want to quote here Michelle Alexander from her book, The New Jim Crow, where she describes how racist enforcement of civil laws has created this system of oppression in jails and prisons that has replaced slavery as an institution of control for Black men, women, and children. And you can see here that she points out how 1 in 3 young African-American men are currently under the control of the criminal justice system. That might be in prison, in jail, on probation, on parole. Yet mass incarceration tends to be categorized as a criminal justice issue, as opposed to a racial justice or a civil rights issue or crisis. This slide is from the Utah Commission for Civil, Criminal, and Juvenile Justice, and it shows what I was speaking to, that our incarceration rates across the country are disproportionate. You can see the rates that Black people are incarcerated, the rates of Hispanic incarcerations, and at the end, the rates of white incarceration. This system has unique consequences for non-citizens. So again, really trying to illustrate the intersections between these two systems, between a criminal legal system and our immigration system. The way that maybe it illustrates this most powerfully is the crime of unlawful entry and re-entry. And this is a statute that's part of the federal law that says if you unlawfully enter the country or re-enter the country, you have committed a misdemeanor for entry or a felony for illegal re-entry. This crime is prosecuted at a truly astonishing level, despite there being questionable public safety implications and really no deterrent effect. In 2016, these charges equaled more than half the federal criminal prosecutions, and that level jumped significantly under 2019. What I want to point out here is that many individuals who are prosecuted for this crime actually don't understand that they are being criminally prosecuted. They often believe that they are just being held and deported as part of the immigration control system, not the criminal legal system in the United States. For individuals who are not citizens, there is a deportation risk and that includes refugees, that includes individuals with a green card, anyone who is convicted of a crime who is a non-citizen has that deportation risk as well. There is a whole separate immigration detention system that for years did not attract a lot of attention. It holds individuals for immigration purposes at truly an incredible level. On any given day, there are tens of thousands of individuals who are held in immigration detention. This system gained more public attention with the spike in families being detained for immigration purposes over the past few years, but it really does still operate kind of in the shadows. Many county jails will rent out cells to immigration enforcement authorities. So you'll have a jail that in some wings are holding people for punitive purposes for their criminal convictions. And you'll have the cell next door maybe holding someone for non-punitive immigration purposes. The purpose of immigration theoretically is to ensure compliance with our immigration laws, but individuals can spend years in immigration detention. These facilities are sadly prone to medical abuse. There are several individuals, unfortunately, who have died in immigration custody. And in May, ICE, which is the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, stopped using a Georgia detention facility in the wake of allegations of dozens of hysterectomies being performed on immigrant detainees without their consent. This particular practice stirred painful memories of forced sterilizations being practiced overwhelmingly on Black, Indigenous, and Latinx people living with disabilities. One other point I want to make on the criminal legal system and how it intersects with our immigration system is the role of private prison corporations. And the ACLU has sued private prison companies over and over again. We see higher rates of civil rights violations. We see higher rates of abuse in prisons that are operated by private prison corporations. Interestingly, President Biden announced that he would begin phasing down private prison contracts for the criminal legal system, but not for the immigration detention system, which then prompted some corporations to announce that they will then begin to alter their contracts to work for immigration enforcement as opposed to the federal criminal legal system. Let's shift to the community impact. So we've talked so far about othering entire communities, individuals, about the fear that drives some of those policies, about the deprivation of rights that often accompanies that othering. But many undocumented immigrants and BIPOC communities are living, working in the shadows without the full protection of the laws. For undocumented immigrants, that often means they lack labor law protections. They're frequently the victim of wage theft. In some states, they are unable to obtain a driver's license. They report crime to the police at a far lower level because they fear that deportation will quickly follow for themselves or a family member. Many immigrants lived in a mixed status family or a mixed status neighborhood. They themselves might have status, but perhaps a neighboring family or a grandmother or someone in their household may not. And those fears and that shared experience of living in the shadows is something that is prevalent across the immigrant population as a whole. We currently represent a family where a law enforcement task force raided their apartment. They were looking for a family member who was not home, but instead arrested the grandmother who was at home babysitting her grandchildren. The grandmother lacked immigration status and was taken into immigration custody. The law enforcement officials then returned the next night, attempted to force the family to provide information on the individual who was the target of the search, and began using the grandmother's immigration status as a threat to the entire family. We are currently in active litigation on that case, hoping to restore that family's constitutional rights. Black, Indigenous, people of color, those communities similarly have valid reason to distrust law enforcement agencies and government institutions. Many families last summer explained that they simply won't call 911 in an emergency for fear of the police causing more harm if they were to arrive. What I'm talking about here is earned mistrust that we as a history, many of our policies, many of our laws are signaling to these immigrant communities, to these BIPOC communities, that they should not trust we the people, the government. Yet when we ask them to come forward, there's often surprise that they are unwilling to believe that their rights matter and that their rights will be respected. We see communities and voting precincts that are heavily immigrant, heavily people of color being told, stay in line and vote, your vote will count. Even though states are making it more and more difficult for those same communities to vote. We saw last year messages to the immigrant community, please participate in the census, fill out these forms, it's really important, we want you to be counted. Yet, the government was also attempting to add a question about your citizenship status, while simultaneously ramping up efforts to deport immigrant communities. The final example I'll list here are vaccination rates and health impacts. There is vaccine hesitancy in both the immigrant community and communities of color. This has been connected to documented medical experimentation on these same communities. As I mentioned earlier, there is a shameful past of carrying out unconsented medical experiments on these communities, and we should not be surprised at the lack of trust and skepticism as a result. This slide is based on data from the Laborers' Health and Safety Fund of North America, and it shows racial gaps in COVID-19 death rates. So clearly a very timely illustration of what ongoing and past abuses of civil rights might create. Public health experts have been asked why, what is responsible for these disparities in COVID-19? And many of them are tied to systemic discrimination and structural racism. I want to share a quote by Marcela Nunez-Smith. She's the Director of Equity Research and Innovation Center at the Yale School of Medicine. These racial ethnic disparities are the result of pre-pandemic realities. It's a legacy of structural discrimination that has limited access to health and wealth for people of color. Here in Utah, the ACLU has worked to prevent unlawful requirements in testing and vaccinations for individuals during the pandemic. We have seen some individuals at testing centers, at vaccine sites, requiring social security numbers, even though there is no law or policy that requires a social security number. We actively pushed government health agencies to provide information in languages other than English, as is required under civil rights laws. And we've also worked in collaboration with the National ACLU Network to push for the safety of individuals who are incarcerated during a pandemic. We received many, many complaints from individuals in incarceration and their families that they were not given masks, that they were given squirt bottles full of water as a way to keep themselves safe while living in a community environment during the pandemic. So what would it look like for oppression to become empowerment? The ACLU works to challenge unconstitutional laws and actions in a variety of ways. We're probably most known for our lawsuits, for trying to strike down unconstitutional laws in court, but we also do a lot of work in state legislatures and in the US Congress to try to change laws that are either discriminatory, that violate the Constitution, or that have the potential to do so if it's a proposed bill. We also provide a lot of public education to help individuals exercise their own rights. We want people to know that they shouldn't open their door if the law enforcement agent on their front steps can't show you a warrant, or you have the right to protest. Even though someone might be telling you to move along, the First Amendment is still in effect. So we do a lot of public education with the hopes of reminding people that they do have the rights that the Constitution promises them. I listed here 4 points that I think might help bridge us past oppression and to a more inclusive, welcoming society. Everyone needing to feel welcome is a hallmark of a society where civil rights and human rights are respected. This will require a lot of reforms. Institutions need to be overhauled. That includes the government, that includes education, that includes healthcare systems. The ACLU focuses on the government. Almost all of our work is in opposition to government actions, government practices, and that's where we focus our time. Recently, we've been spending a lot of time on voting rights. We feel that where voting rights are equally respected, where congressional district lines are fairly drawn, those communities then have the power to vote, the power to choose their leaders, the power to live in a representative government that is of them and for them. Another hallmark of an inclusive system might be immigrants being recognized as having constitutional rights. They do. Everyone in the United States is protected by the Constitution. Instead of relegating millions of individuals to a sort of limbo state where their rights are not always fully protected, where they live in fear of exploitation and deportation. Finally, an inclusive system would not rely on mass incarceration and would root out racial disparities in our law enforcement systems. Those disparities pop up from arrest to the charges that are brought to the sentences that are handed down. We also need truth. We must acknowledge the impact of centuries of segregation and exclusion and our current lack of equality and the ongoing racism in our institutions and our opportunities. The ACLU has spent decades resisting the banning of books, resisting the censorship of speech, and we feel so strongly about the right to free speech that we've even defended hateful speech and really abhorrent speech, because that's in the First Amendment. Truth is really intertwined with reconciliation and healing, and it requires telling the truth about our historical and our present day racism and oppression. I want to mention intersectional campaigns as being critical to overcoming our lack of full civil rights and human rights. Frederick Douglass, who's known as an abolitionist for ending slavery and increasing the right to vote, also championed ending the Chinese Exclusion Act. He recognized that if one population was being denied justice, it was more likely that everyone would be denied justice. I want to reference Standing Rock and the collaboration that took place there between environmental activists, between groups like the ACLU that protect free speech and the right to protest, and Indigenous leaders opposing pipeline construction through native land. In addition to what organizations like the ACLU do in courts and in Congress, there are other mechanisms that would disrupt the status quo and perhaps move us closer to full civil rights for all. Options being discussed include reparations for individuals who experience slavery. And the argument for reparations is that we will never achieve racial justice in America if this country does not examine the impact of slavery and its legacy and make strides towards achieving reparatory justice. Providing equal access to constitutional rights and eradicating discrimination and oppression must be a mutual effort undertaken by all Americans, with leadership from directly impacted communities and support from all of us. This really is everyone's fight. But we are undeniably moving, slowly as it might feel, towards a more just society for immigrants, for Black, Indigenous, people of color, for those communities, and for all Americans.
Thanks, Brittany, so much. So now I think what we're going to do is open it up to sort of have a question and answer period. Audience members are encouraged to submit questions. And I have a few just sort of big picture things I kind of wanted to start off with that sort of I think more focuses on your work over the arc of your professional career. So I wonder if you might comment a little bit on the differences of working on issues at a national level. So you spend a lot of time in Washington, D.C. doing advocacy at a national level on federal policy. And while the ACLU does work on constitutional issues, I think a lot of the work that you do, particularly as an executive director of a state affiliate, is state advocacy. And so maybe talk a little bit about the differences of doing state and federal advocacy. And then different, but I think related, is also you've also worked for both faith-based and secular organizations on advocating on similar issues. And is there something different about doing that work in those spaces? So maybe you could start with those two.
Sure, happy to. There's a lot of similarities between working with a national advocacy organization pushing for congressional change at the national level and working in a state. Perhaps the biggest difference is the level of access. It can be incredibly frustrating to try to actually speak to a member of Congress. You have to go through multiple layers, Aaron knows. You have to call the front desk, try to get the right staff person. They might let you see the member of Congress. And if you're really lucky, you might get 5 minutes of their time. Whereas at the state level, I couldn't believe it. My first week on the job, someone's like, oh, we'll just text so-and-so, the state senator who's the head of that committee. And that's how it works. They don't really have staff. They're in session for 45 days a year versus year round. And you can just pop in and see them or text them or call them or email them. And when they're not in session, you can go out to lunch and chat about what's on your mind. So the level of access is perhaps less of a challenge at the state level. But beyond that, I feel like there's a whole set of tools that's open to you at the state level as well, using the state constitution, using state regulations, for example, or looking at ways that you can go through the city or the county or the state to try to bring about change. So maybe just different levels and different levers to pull as well. Great question about the experience working with a faith-based organization versus more of a legal civil rights organization. A lot of the work overlaps quite a bit. So when I was part of Lutheran Immigrant and Refugee Service, we worked for a more welcoming country for refugees and immigrants. We worked to improve conditions in immigration detention. We stood up for the rights of unaccompanied children. And we did that, we felt, from the moral high ground, that we could reference welcome the stranger as a moral philosophy, as almost a calling and a appeal to this is the right thing to do. From the ACLU perspective, we say, yes, it's definitely the right thing to do. And if you don't do it, we'll sue you, which gives you a little bit more power behind the moral appeal.
Great. There's a few questions around different immigration issues in particular, and I'm going to kind of try to group them together, and then you can kind of walk through them. So one question I thought that was really a great question was sort of, you mentioned in your presentation the images of what's been happening on the border with Haitian refugees and how they've been treated by Customs and Border Patrol. In addition, they've also been summarily deported by Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. Simultaneously, there's been a huge amount of work by the State Department and Congress to try to evacuate Afghani women and children from Afghanistan, have them be part of this resettlement program. And the audience member is just curious if you could sort of talk through, like, why are different communities treated differently? Is it partly their color? Is it partly where they're at, being situated on the border versus being abroad? Does it have to do with our U.S. intervention, in Afghanistan, sort of those kind of complex issues? Historically, Haitian refugees have been given the short shrift, right? This is not a new phenomenon, but under the Biden administration, it's troubling to see as well. So there's that set of questions. And then related, you are on a close to the border. And one of the audience members was curious if you could talk about children, unaccompanied children, and children being abandoned at the border, and if the ACLU is doing any work around that.
Yes. So there are two different legal systems for seeking protection in the US. If you are on the refugee track, you are identified and processed as a refugee outside of the United States. So all of that vetting, all of that paperwork happens abroad, and everyone knows you're coming. We know what flight you're on. The Refugee Resettlement Agency knows to meet you at the airport. They know how old your children are. They know what languages you speak, and they can be ready to welcome you when you arrive here. The Asylum Track means you show up, you're in the United States, physically present in the US, and you're asking for protection. So no one knows you're coming. In fact, you're not really welcome. The US has a very harsh system of responding to someone who knocks on the door and says, I'd like to have asylum in your country, please. We generally, as a matter of law, put you in detention and then sort out your asylum case subsequently. So what is happening with the Haitian migrants and Central American migrants, to be candid, at the border is there are new barriers being erected to keep them from even reaching the door. So they can't quite even knock to say, I would like to seek asylum. That's what happened with the Haitians, is that they encountered this Title 42 public health law. They encountered Border Patrol not letting them actually cross the Rio Grande and seek asylum. And as you said, Aaron, they were summarily deported without being given the opportunity to make that claim for protection. And yes, I think race does play a part of this. The first use of Guantanamo as a detention center was for Haitian asylum seekers who were apprehended at sea and rerouted to Guantanamo. But, you know, the refugee system also does welcome many refugees from the Congo, from Sudan. So it's not as if you're a Black immigrant, you're not welcome. It's just perhaps that much harder once you make it here.
And maybe you could speak a little bit about the children on the border.
The children, yes. So the ACLU has been involved in the treatment of unaccompanied children when they're not really in custody, they're in care. So the treatment of unaccompanied children is yet another immigration system. They are not in the care of the Department of Homeland Security. They're under the Department of Health and Human Services. Where the ACLU has been involved is ensuring that those children still retain their rights, that they have the rights to healthcare, that they have the rights to reunite with their family in a fair way. But we have teamed up with the whole immigration movement to kind of divide out the work of championing immigrants' rights, because there is too much for any organization to take on. So it really is an effort of immigration attorneys, child advocates, refugee advocates, legal advocates, and it's completely overwhelming. I think if you talk to anyone right now dealing with the evacuation of Afghanistan, on top of Central American families coming here, on top of Haitians fleeing the earthquake and an unstable political situation, the word that comes up over and over again is overwhelming.
So I think you did a great job in your presentation, Brittany, of really identifying some of the challenges and problems that, you know, the Black community and people of color and Indigenous populations and immigrants are facing with respect to the federal government and state and local authorities, as just well as some of the narratives, right, that get portrayed about these different populations. And one of the audience members was wondering, what in your mind are the kind of things, both from a scholarly and pragmatic view, can be done to sort of change these narratives? So in addition to sort of combating things on the ground like the ACLU is, which is kind of reacting to government policies, what kind of work can be done sort of in that peace building space, right?
Sure.
Of working on changing the narratives, and what kind of advice might you have for us on that?
That's a great question. The types of stories that are told matters. As I said, the narrative cannot be the one person in the immigrant community that is accused of a terrible crime.
Right.
That gets picked up over and over and over again, and you hear less about all of the good works and the kindnesses and the contributions to community that immigrants and refugees and people of color are doing over and over again. So I think the type of story matters. I think that even within the immigrant population, you have this unfortunate narrative of the good immigrant and the bad immigrant. It's something Aaron and I worked with a lot when we were in Congress, is that it felt like you were constantly having to explain, like, no, there is no line for people to stand in. These are not just lawbreakers who didn't want to come into the country the right way. There is no right way. There's no visa to apply for. So it's having to do a lot of the background education and really have that basis of understanding that isn't picked up in, you know, the easy to read People magazine article.
Yeah, great, thank you. This is actually a question that's specific to something you mentioned in your presentation, which is, you talked about sort of the COVID response in immigrant communities and sort of the water bottle. And one of the audience members was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that that story and how you learned about it and sort of what happened there. They were just interested in that.
Which story was it,
I
Erin?
think you talked about how instead of vaccines were not given out, water bottles or squirted, or water was squirted at them.
Oh, yeah. So that was in a county jails here have had really uneven responses to keeping individuals safe in the outbreak of COVID. The number of phone calls we have had to make to ensure that people in county jails are given masks is just maddening. And there were credible reports coming from one jail early in the pandemic where there were no actual cleaners available, there were no masks available, there were no tests. People who were symptomatic were not being moved away from other people being held in confinement. One individual said that the jail gave him a squirt bottle of water and said, you can clean the bars on your cell with this. This is all we can do for you. So we filed a lawsuit and we said, this is not constitutional. You cannot hold people like this. The counties responded. We ultimately were not allowed to proceed because we were found not to have standing, so kind of a legal technicality. But because we filed that lawsuit, many of the counties then were prompted to release their COVID protocols, which we feel led to better treatment of people being incarcerated. But one interesting maybe silver lining of COVID-19 is that many other jails and prisons did respond by saying, we're going to reevaluate the custody of some of the people and we're going to release them early. We're going to move as many people out as we can. We don't feel like anyone should be given a death sentence because of a pandemic. And there were no resulting, huge crime waves from that. Everything was fine. It turned out that people who were being released were being evaluated on their risk factors, and they're doing better in the community than they were doing when they were incarcerated. So I think it is encouraging a deeper look at why are we incarcerating people, and are there other alternatives that maybe accomplish public safety needs as well as humanitarian principles.
So this is, I think, just sort of a final question for you as we wrap up this hour. You've been doing this work for a long time in various different roles with various different hats and various different administrations, and it's hard work. I mean, it's really hard work. Trying to help people who don't have access to systems, oftentimes people who are marginalized, or in fact, increasingly we've seen over the last several years, sects of the population that are increasingly antagonistic and almost even violently antagonistic towards the populations that you and the organizations that you're working with in the community are working on. So how do you sustain yourself? Sort of what do you do to kind of continue to kind of have that fire in your belly to kind of keep going forward, and what advice you might impart on the audience about that?
Oh, wow. That's a real challenge right now. And I feel like many people that I worked with in the immigrant advocacy community did move on, that after it became really tough under the last administration, they were burned out and they moved on to a different field where they thought maybe there was more opportunity. And I think that's healthy. I think bringing in new voices and new perspectives and having veterans maybe step aside and make space for the next generation is critically important. For me, moving from DC to Utah, where I was able to work on a different range of issues and with different government leaders that perhaps were more receptive or had different ideas, that reinvigorated me. So I think you do have to be mindful of, am I becoming burned out? Am I becoming cynical? Am I becoming bitter? And really work to refocus yourself on, why am I doing this work? What is it at the end of the day that I'm proud of? And for me, that's standing up for vulnerable communities, for making sure that one group isn't hoarding all the power and the privilege for themselves, and that we're living up to what we say we're all about in our founding documents.
And just the final question. So today, the Nobel Peace Prize Committee recognizes the role of journalism in peace building. And I'm just curious, how has the ACLU worked with journalists, particularly in the context of those who are working to advance human rights and protecting their right to free speech?
Very closely. Journalists are all about seeking the truth. And as I mentioned, sometimes getting that is a challenge in and of itself. So journalists are dogged when it comes to accessing government records, to finding someone who can tell their personal story that is much different than the story that is on the official press release that just went out. So we work very closely with journalists, often to uncover something that we heard a rumor about, what's really going on. Do you have the facts on this? We recently worked with Salt Lake City Police to try to learn more about officer-involved shootings. We suspected that the rates of shootings for Black, Indigenous, or people of color would be higher than white people. We didn't have the resources to dig into that, but our local newspaper did. And now there's a conversation within law enforcement about, why is that? So I think asking the questions, trying to get to the truth, and then informing the public, maybe shattering myths or exposing inequalities is a shared goal of civil rights organizations and journalists.
Well, great. Well, Brittany, thank you so much for being in conversation with us today. And while I wish I could have seen you in person, I think the ability for you to do this remotely has allowed for us to have a wider diversity of an audience, and just, continue to do the work that you're doing. And I hope that we can welcome you to the campus back to Notre Dame soon and in person. But thank you. You have done us all very proud, and it's been a very inspiring conversation today. So thank you very much.
Thank you.